My name is Najy Benhassine. I'm country director here for World Bank, but I'm here more as a because I like this topic and I worked on it in the past. I'm an economist, although I was an engineer before switching to economics, and I worked on development economics. And at the World Bank, I worked on private sector development, investment, cash transfers, and social protection in education. A lot in the Arab countries, but also in sub-Saharan Africa, and now in Pakistan for the past 3 years, where I had our program in the country. And because I had the program in the country, we're increasing the type of work, the impact relations work we're doing in Pakistan on our project. I'm from Algeria, so you probably have gone through a lot of the material I would present. I suggest I'm going to go through the slides, but do interrupt me if you have any question, if you want examples, if you disagree on anything. But I will insist on a few points, but I will not cover all the 40 plus slides. So the field of impact evaluation has grown, as many of you may know, over the past, say, 20 years. With the economic profession, development economics, has been profoundly affected by how rigorous impact evaluations have evolved. Because we realize that as much as there's been a lot of work by developing countries since independences, and many institutions like the World Bank are doing a lot of work, in many topics we have little evidence on really what works and what does not. And actually, we have big picture things that we know, like growth is good for poverty reduction. Nobody would disagree on that. But specifically, what interventions really can contribute to poverty reduction or to improve schooling or other things is something that we don't know. And often decisions are made often on politics. And the incentives is not necessarily driven by whether the choice of policies and public spending will really have the biggest impact, but naturally politicians are driven by their own voting. Problem with microphone? No, okay. Is driven by attracting votes, and that may be at odds. But often also decisions on, or our view of what's important or not, is driven by emotions or by what priors that we may have. Like when I started my career not even before my career, when I was like you, a student, I was on a project in Kenya where in these very poor villages, some NGOs were giving textbooks. And they didn't have any textbooks. So for me, it was obvious that we should give textbooks. Why are we even asking the question of why we're giving textbooks? And investing in schooling, since an obvious one. And it's dangerous to base our views on development and what government should do based on our priors and things. We've learned the hard way that. Oh, thank you. We've learned the hard way that many interventions not necessarily have the. Is this working? Okay, not necessarily have the desired impact. The other reason. So impact evaluations are useful to inform what are the best interventions and what's the best use of public money. So that's obvious, but it's also ex post, obviously, useful to answer the question about whether the money was well used or not, and whether it had its impact. But most often, impact evaluations are done midway, when we start projects, when we start interventions, when we start pilots, with the theoretical idea that we will learn as we go from the impact evaluation, and some things could be stopped or corrected. I'm saying theoretically because in practice, when politicians start projects, and announce and start spending, it's very, very difficult to course correct, even when the evidence shows, yes, thank you, even when the evidence. So having impact evaluations ex post can be very useful to see whether things work and not, but also at what cost, and to learn from interventions. So for example, it seems obvious, everybody would agree, that improving schooling, say in Pakistan in particular, is an important thing. But today, and this is very concrete, in your country, the what we call learning poverty, that's, for example, the percentage of children age 10 who can read a simple text, and there's is very high. I think 70% of children age 10 out of school on average cannot read text. There's 22 million children that are out of school. So so I heard 28 this morning, but so it's 28 now? Okay. Why has it increased? Because it was 22 last year or 2 years ago. I mean, latest estimates are 28. Okay, so that's huge. That's the highest number in the world, by the way. It used to be Nigeria, now it's Pakistan. Now the question is, and that's concrete for us, for example, when we work with government at the World Bank, because we want to work on education, we want to invest more. It's not obvious what to do, because you could build new schools and new classrooms. That's absolutely needed in Pakistan, especially in certain rural districts when middle schools are far or schools are far, especially for girls. Should you invest in teachers? When you talk to a teacher's special education specialist, depending on what they worked on or their thesis, they will pick one of these topics and think this is the most important. Do teacher incentives work? Should we give more power to schools to decide what to do in their school? That's what we call funding school councils, provide books, as I mentioned. Then others are a lot into the digital. We should have iPads to everywhere. The evidence on this is very weak, by the way. Build roads for access to school. So the difficulty with all of these is that we cannot do everything. There's limited budget, and the impact of these may vary between countries. So, and it's a question that's fundamental. Like, for Pakistan is probably spending at least half what it should spend on education compared to other countries of the same income, at least half. But it's easy to tell a government, oh, you should double your spending. I mean, first they need to find the revenues. But even if they were to increase the spending, knowing where to invest in is a very difficult question. So what I'd like you to focus on the fourth bullet point there only. To all these questions of what works, what doesn't, what's important, and I'm starting to introduce a few terms which many of you know already, but still, is that we want to have to estimate, to be able to answer this question. We need to have unbiased evidence, come back to this question of biasness, that attribution is a term that will come again, the measured impact to a given intervention only in a causal way. And these seem obvious, but this is extremely difficult to do an impact evaluation, to collect data that gives you evidence that's unbiased, where you can really say, like, if scores have improved in some schools, can you really attribute it to the books that have been provided or to the extra classroom in a causal way? Are you sure that there's a link of causality? So I'll come back to these three terms. Yes, I'll go through this list of Pakistan-specific questions that remain, in my view, unanswered. And I know I like to use this example because PIDE, including a number of researchers here, Najy and Sujat, who are friends, have worked on this. For example, BISP, that's I think at the federal level one of the largest budgets of government. Are they able to reduce poverty or not? That's a fundamental question. It's probably the second or third budget line in the government budget. And then BISP also have a conditional cash transfer program for education, especially for girls, with a premium for girls. Is it working or not? We don't know yet. Every year at budget time, including these days, you hear or you read in the newspapers that export sectors, they come and they ask for tax breaks, or they ask for cheaper electricity or cheaper gas because they want to export. You know, ideally, in a perfect world, a government would want to know, because tax breaks to exporters have been provided for years in Pakistan. Are they impactful? Are they? Can we really make a link between? It's difficult. It's difficult to find out. And the typical answer you would hear is, "Oh, we've provided tax breaks, say 2 years ago, and exports went up. We should do it again," which is obviously a biased, non-causal, and non-attributable statement. The Sehat card as well, etc. So just a few names that you probably know. This revolution in empirical economics and impact relations led lately in 2019 and 2021 to a series of Nobel Prizes to recognize the profession. Banerjee, Duflo, and Kremer in 2019, as you know. And then 2 years later, and it's pretty rare that on the same topic, 2 years in a row, you get people from the same field being recognized, and Imban, Sangris, and Carter, three of them. Okay, let's start with the basics on impact relations. And as much as all of you may know this, it is amazing how much, when you go in practice in institutions, development partners, or government, there's a lot of mixing up of these terms of what they mean: monitoring, evaluation, and impact relations. People mix them all the time. Maybe because you're into this, especially those who are starting their research, you know this very well, but you would be absolutely surprised how much people use impact relation when they mean monitoring. They use monitoring when they use something else. So monitoring is the basic that we should always do, that governments should always do when engaging in a project or spending public money. That's collecting information, just collecting information to track whether inputs that or activities are being achieved. You know, there's a budget line to do rural roads. Are the roads built? That's monitoring. That says and that's usually 99% of statements you hear in the press or in the public discourse or by governments and sometimes donor partners as well, is in the realm of monitoring. We have spent that much billion rupees on that topic. We have built that many kilometers of road, and we have built that many schools. All of this is monitoring, or usually it's just at the level of spending. We've spent that many billions. Sometimes when it's a bit better, it's more actual activities. We've built roads, we've built a number of hospitals. All of this says nothing whether these things are working. So, and that's important to remember. Next time you read newspapers or you look at declaration from partners, try to think whether they're speaking about monitoring or whether they're speaking about impact. So unfortunately, for now, 99% is usually monitoring. Evaluation goes a step further. Evaluation, it's using that data, doing at least an analytical effort to see whether a given program or investment, whether it's costly, what its performance. So, for example, we can estimate how much a kilometer of rural road has cost, and compare that with similar roads in other countries or in other regions, and we can say, and how fast it has been built and what's the quality. That's evaluating whether what we've done is done well at a good cost and at a good price. And that's another level beyond monitoring. We can also evaluate processes, delays, etc. And that's good. And that's also rare compared to impact evaluations. When we often say the government X has spent that much billion on certain area. Having an idea of whether that's a lot or not a lot compared to similar projects in other countries is rarely done. But that's just evaluation. Again, getting that tells you nothing about the impact of the project or the spending in question. Yes, please. Thank you for interrupting. I appreciate so that we have an exchange.
Find them very simplistic in nature. But I want to know that why don't we say simple assessment of something, assessing a project, or examining something? Why we use the word evaluation? Did some eminent scholar of the field point this term? That's why we are following this, suit, or what? I mean, why we are not saying simply assessing a project? And then you mentioned that we evaluate a project or development project in the mid of its. What's that mid? What's that mid of that project?
So,
I mean, based is an ongoing project. I don't know what's its mid. So how do we evaluate that? What is the mid of some project?
Right. So the word evaluation, sometimes people use assessment. I don't think there's a difference. You can use whatever you want. So there's nothing, and you can use assessment instead of evaluation. There's no, but the point I'm trying to make here is that is the difference between evaluation or assessment of metrics that indicate the cost or the delay or the quality of a project or of public spending versus being able to say that whatever was done, whether it's expensive or not, well done or not done, took years to do or was fast, that's the evaluation or the assessment part, whether it's impactful to the ultimate objective we want. So when we give books to school, it's not that we care particularly that books are sitting on tables in school. What we care about is that children learn. And this link between, oh, yes, books of good quality have reached the tables in schools, that's an assessment, and the cost was not too high. That's an evaluation or an assessment. Being able to say, oh, these books on the desk of these kids, they're learning more, it reduced learning poverty, is the impact evaluation. That's the distinction. Now, mid-project, in the best cases, you generally start evaluations or impact evaluations when the project starts or even before, so that you, at any point in the project, whether in the middle, whether in early, whatever data you collect will start give you clues on whether the project is achieving its impact or is on track to achieve its impact or not. So there's no right or wrong definition or when is a midway of a project. Could be early, could be later. So the impact evaluation is the upper stage of what we want to have a look at today. And this is the way it's framed is important. It's an analytical effort, obviously, based on data, to be able to prove that whatever spending or intervention was done really made a difference on whatever you're measuring, which means you would like to know what would have happened without the intervention and say, with the intervention, things are better, more impactful than without the intervention. And this is what makes this field so difficult, because you're trying to compare the reality, we brought books into the school, with something that did not happen, meaning what if we did not bring the books to the school? Then you compare the two. But we don't know what would have happened without an intervention. So when you try to estimate whether exports, incentives, tax breaks, breaks on power are good for exporters, ideally what you want to say is you want to be able to do an experiment and say, let's see how exporters do without the tax break or the support. Now let's give them the tax break and the support, and let's see whether it works or not. But what I just described is impossible. An exporter either gets support or doesn't. And that's exactly why impact relations are so difficult and why this discipline has evolved over the past years, because these researchers have developed methods to be able to answer this question that's difficult. Okay, I'm going to skip the part on evaluation just because we don't have that much time, and I would like to have an exchange. So I'll let me move. Yes, let me just move to this slide to look at the logical framework. So I want to go back to this example on textbooks that I mentioned earlier, on which I worked 25 years ago now. So this was an area of Kenya that was really poor, that is still very poor. It's called Busia district. And they had low learning outcomes, basically not enough schools, not enough teachers, no books, etc. And particularly, we realized that in this district, not only the conditions in the school were not good, but there was no books. No children had books in the school. So this NGO devised a program to try to provide books to the children in primary school. Basically, one book per half the class, one book for two children, and they would share. So the logical framework of an impact evaluation is obviously as follows. The number one thing you want to follow is you need to get those books to the schools. That's the inputs. Usually, a lot of what we it's not working. A lot of what many people report on is just this stage. We have spent $150 million on books for schools. That's just the input. The output is that the books arrive at the school and are in the hands of the children. That you can say, okay, we've provided books. That step, which seems obvious, just that is not obvious at all. Because sometimes books get stolen, books get lost. There's plenty of evidence of governments procuring something in the center, but then only a fraction of it reaches a village. And you can have plenty of examples where there's a disconnect between input and output. Another one is teachers' presence. I don't know whether teachers' absenteeism is a problem in Pakistan in the rural areas, but in many countries it is. You have teachers that are recruited, teachers that are paid. That's an input. That doesn't say anything about whether they are present every day at school is really the output. Yes, teachers are in class. And you can go a bit further. The real output is that teachers are in class and they're actually teaching. All of these, which seem obvious, are extremely hard to measure. You know, the Ministry of Education cannot follow teachers. So monitoring presence for teachers is extremely difficult. And so that was just output. Outcome would be, are children really using the books, or are teachers also using the books? And right until now, even if all three are positive, yes, books have been bought, that's an input. Books have been delivered are in the schools. That's an output. Very good. Imagine you have perfect score on that. Number three, children are using the books in school and the teacher are using it to teach. That's fantastic. But so far, that doesn't tell you anything about what we're really after, that the children are learning. To get to the actual question we're interested in, which is, is children learning improving? You need to measure impact. The impact, measuring test scores is one way. There's other ways, of course, but the best proxy we know on whether children are learning is to look at their test scores. This chain is what eventually you hope will lead children to learn better. And children learning better, we hope that that will improve their life. That's an even longer outcome that is very hard to measure, and there's very few studies that do that. But I just wanted to keep that framework for you, to keep that framework in mind, so that whenever there's a policy discussion on any intervention, try to figure out what is being done, where is the money being spent, is whatever money being spent reaching the schools or the roads of good quality? Is it being used? Until we often get that go to any web page of a project, you'll get a lot on input. Sometimes you get output, rarely you get outcomes, and very rarely it's spoken about impact. And this is why this field is now much bigger. In this, process evaluation is something I want to spend a minute on. It's not about impact, but something that is usually embedded when we do impact evaluations is to also understand the process of a project and how it's going. So it's not only focusing on the outcomes, but as I said, our textbooks measuring the outcomes, the inputs and the outputs is a process evaluation. Is money being spent? Are textbooks reaching the classroom? Are teachers present? Can the service be, what are the costs? Can the service be provided at a lower cost? Are we reaching the right population? That's also something we don't often ask. So, for example, we're doing a survey together with BISP to know whether BISP transfers, as we expect them to be, are reaching the right population. We assume so because BISP is using social registry, an SCR. But still, we don't know. Until you don't see data, that's your students, you know that. Until you don't see rigorous data, we don't know anything. So we can assume. Okay, I already spent time on this. Okay. So let me go deeper into the impact evaluation part of that logical framework. So the fourth box, and try to get you a sense of why it's so difficult to get causal inference. Causal inference meaning being able to say that whatever intervention is being done is causing the impact that you're measuring, and why it's so difficult. The reason, and some terminology. The reason. So some definition, establishing attribution and causality, coming back to these two words, is that what we call the treatment effect, which is the measured impact on the population that are benefiting from an intervention, say these children who are receiving books in a school, can be attributed to the intervention. We can be sure that the intervention is the causal and the only reason why the outcome you're measuring is being improved. So, for example, exports 2 years ago have been going up. They're not now, but 2 years ago they've been going up. At the same time, the government has been providing incentives to exporters. What's very difficult is to know whether these incentives, what part of this improvement in exports that we saw 2 years ago in Pakistan were, if at all, driven by these tax breaks and incentives. That's an extremely difficult question to answer. So there's different models. It can be universities, and often impact evaluations are done by universities. Governments can have impact evaluation units, but they usually don't sit in the same ministries. So you wouldn't have necessarily, it's rare, but you wouldn't have necessarily a Ministry of Education having its own impact evaluation unit evaluate. It could be, but there's a problem of conflict of interest and independence. So you'd rather have independent units or independent bodies that evaluate a policy of a given ministry. But often it's a gray area. Often institutions work together with academia, with donor partners. But it's always good to have academic institutions in it because they bring independence, credibility. That's a very good point. So as I mentioned earlier, in theory, having the perfect impact evaluation would take measuring learning of kids in a school or measuring exports for exporters with the intervention and comparing that with what would have happened in the absence of the intervention. That's what's an ideal theoretical impact evaluation, is observing at the same time the children when they get the textbooks and comparing that to the same children not receiving the textbooks. The difference between the two, because the same people, would be the impact. That's impossible. You cannot, it's either they received or not. It's either an exporter received the tax break or it did not. So you cannot compare these two situations. This is exactly why this field is difficult, because all the econometric techniques that you see in impact evaluation are trying to get as close to this impossible theoretical statement. I don't know if you understand, if everybody is clear on that. Impact evaluation, to be able to say that the impact of bringing a textbook in a school is in a way that's unbiased, that's causal, and that's attributable to these textbooks being brought in a school, requires comparing learning of the children with the textbook with learning of the same child without the textbook. That's impossible, absolutely. But we'll come back to that because we're trying to do that. So, for example, just to give you an example on the BISP cash transfers. So they have been launched in 2008, and when you look at poverty rates in Pakistan, in each of the 4 provinces since 2008, poverty rates have been going down. So at prima facie, at the first look, you could say, wow, BISP launched in 2008, poverty has been declining, therefore BISP has been driving the decline in poverty in Pakistan. Problem is that the poverty decline started in 2001, the major poverty decline. So by not looking at what happened before, you may be tempted to attribute the impact of BISP, the poverty reduction to the BISP, but it's not the case. I'm not saying BISP didn't have a contribution, but at least with this data, poverty rates through time, you cannot conclude. Because the problem here is that when you look at this, we don't know what would have happened to poverty rates in Sindh or Balochistan or the other provinces without BISP. Imagine BISP did not come in 2008. Would poverty have declined less or more? Is impossible to say because BISP is here. That's exactly the impossibility problem that I just described. These examples are already mentioned. Imagine, and I think this is true, we did the survey like this, a representative survey of poor households has shown that the beneficiaries of the education cash transfer program, which is called Wasila Talim, have higher school enrollment rates of their children than non-beneficiaries. Imagine you do a survey of households. Some households, they are receiving cash transfer for education, others they are not. And you observe that the households that receive cash transfers send their children to school more often. Enrollment rates are higher. And based on this data, a researcher concludes Wasila Talim is having impact. What's wrong with this statement? Exactly. Here, comparing households that receive the cash transfer with households that did not receive the cash transfer and just saying attributing any difference between the two groups to the cash transfer is very biased, and because you don't know why some households are not receiving. Maybe they did not. Maybe they were too far, and they did not. They did not know of the program. There can be many reasons that make these two groups of households non-comparable. Exactly. Maybe the enrollment place to enroll is far from your village, but that's also the reason why you're not sending your children to school. So you're not going to enroll, and you're not going to, which means which means it's not the transfer that made the difference, the distance to school. Exactly. Okay, so what we are after through this is causal inference, and causal inference is estimating the causal impact of a program that we're going to call the treatment, as we call it, on some outcome. Let's call it Y. There's no big equation. That's the only slide maybe where there's a little equation. The impact that you measure by is the outcome in the presence of the program minus the outcome without the presence of the program. The problem is that you observe your outcome in the presence of the program. You observe the child that's getting a textbook, but you do not observe the child without the textbook because the child has received the textbook. So that's when I said this was the impossible problem of impact evaluation. It's written here in equation. You always can measure your outcome on people that are targeted by a program. You cannot measure the outcome on these people of not getting the program. So what we do, because we cannot measure, we do not observe what would have happened on beneficiaries if they had not received a textbook, if they have not received a vaccine, if they had not received a cash transfer. We try to estimate something close to that by making an assumption on what would have happened to the household in the absence of the program. That's the whole field of impact evaluation, is trying to come as close as possible to something you don't observe. So the example earlier on the households, one assumption could have been, if you pick households that are exactly the same conditions, same distance, same social characteristics, but for some reason that's unrelated to the outcome, they haven't received the treatment, like the cash transfer, then you can say, these households, they're unlucky, they haven't received the transfer, but they're really the same household as if they have received. So we're getting an estimate of this. Yes? Okay. Very good. I'm coming to that because pre and post is a counter is exactly so is one method. I'm going to come to it, is one method to get close to this. All of this, the terminology to say we are trying to see what would have happened in the absence of the program is looking for a counterfactual scenario. Counterfactual scenario means exactly that. What would have happened in the absence of a certain policy or intervention? That counterfactual, and the assumption on the counterfactual scenario, whether it's valid or not, I'll come back to it, is called an identification assumption. I'm going to come back to these terms, but if I want you to remember some terms from this course, it's the counterfactual scenario, which is how are you using the data, your data, to be able to see the counterfactual, what would have happened in the absence of the program, and what's your assumption. So on the household example I just gave, I said, I'm going to assume that the households are exactly the same, at the same distance. That's the identification assumption. So I'll come back to that. I'll correct with one. It's not that everything else has remained. So if you're comparing two households, exactly. Through time and through the intervention, many things change in the environment. What's important is that the changes are the same for both. It's not that nothing has changed. The changes the two households that are the same distance, everything else remained changed in the same way for both of them, in which case they remain comparable through time. Every impact evaluation you're going to read about, and this is also something I'd like you to remember, have an explicit, sometimes they say it, sometimes they don't, counterfactual scenario. They have some story of how they are trying to estimate what would have happened without the program. And they have some assumption, like these households are the same and their environment is remaining the same. They have some identification assumption. Good papers of impact relation will be explicit and tell you, this is our counterfactual scenario, and this is our identification assumption, but some papers don't. So please keep that in mind, because that's a way to look at whether an impact evaluation exercise or paper is good or not. Is their counterfactual solid and strong? Is their identification assumption solid and strong? Let me move a bit faster, just so that. So let me use different examples of what would be counterfactual scenarios. One of them, we call this before and after. This is, who mentioned before and after? What you did, okay. Is going to say, we're gonna compare children in the school who are receiving textbooks to themselves, the same children, before, a year before. And the year before, they didn't have textbooks. So the difference between how they are learning with textbooks compared to how they were learning 2 years before should give us the counterfactual is the children in the past. You can say children in the past were younger, they were in different classes, they were so there's that's what we call before and after analysis. A before and after analysis also have obviously an identification assumption. Let me just test. What would be the identification assumption of a before and after analysis? Same level of IQ. So I don't know what is IQ. What is that? Okay, we're coming to randomized control trial. That's my fourth counterfactual experiment. But many impact evaluations that you see, either explicitly or implicitly, are basing in before and after. You know, when people say exports have increased for these companies, and we following us giving them a tax break, that's a before and after methodology. It's before and after, but there's a control trial. So let me go through the methods and I'll go. Yes, please. So before and after, the identification assumption, which is very strong, is that the conditions surrounding the treated person or the firm is not changing through time. Nothing else changes through time. The same over the years. And by definition, a child who's 10 years old is very different from a child. You know, at my age, 1 year doesn't make a difference. When you're 10, when you're 11, is a big difference. So for children, particular before and after, it's not a very convincing identification assumption to say everything else stays the same. Mm-hmm.
So he is very different learning outcomes. Now we in the next class in 4th grade, the learning outcomes are enhanced or according to the textbook which he's studying right now. So can we somehow compare the results of the learning outcomes of class 4, which are after intervention, with the learning outcomes of class 3? The outcomes are obviously different, so results will be different as well.
We could, so we can do anything. What's important is any impact evaluation, because what you just described is a counterfactual, is a technique, is an impact evaluation. No matter how rigorous an impact evaluation is, we should always ask ourselves, is the identification assumption credible and strong? In your case, the identification assumption would be that between class 3 and class 4, nothing else happened that affected the ability to learn of that child or that cohort of children. Imagine one season, agriculture is really bad. Children have to work at home with their parents much more in their farm. They cannot study and you're not observing that. But that change from one year to another affects the learning capacity of the child. This is what makes before and after through time assumptions a bit difficult, because you're assuming that a lot of factors are staying constant through time. That's a big identification assumption. I will not go into that technicality, but that's right. It's not that individually nothing changes for everyone, but the thing that changes even out, meaning for a child in the class, things will improve and we don't observe, but another one, things will go in the other direction. But I will not go into that technicality, but you are right. The other type of identification assumption or counterfactual, sorry, is to take a group that is similar. So follow different groups, two groups at a time, the treatment group that received an intervention and non-beneficiaries. And the identification there is to assume that they're the same. So in the example I gave you earlier of a household survey that looks at beneficiaries of cash transfer programs and non-beneficiaries and comparing the two, it's fine. It's okay to do that. Huh? But the identification assumption behind it, non-beneficiaries in the same district, for example, having a control group, is that these two groups are exactly the same, or are on average the same, through time, and they remain the same through time. So that the only difference in outcome between the two groups is that the one group received the treatment and the others did not. I'll go in more detail in some of these. Huh? Another one, and I'm going with increased level of rigor and robustness, is a mix between the before and after as well as a control group. Is that you take a group that is comparable, who are non-beneficiaries, and you follow them through time. So it's not only comparing groups that are similar, treatment beneficiaries and non-treatment, so control groups, but you also compare them before and after. And there, so for example, comparing Ihsas is the old name. I haven't updated my slides. If you identify two groups that are similar, or you assume that they're the same, and you can measure their outcomes before the intervention and after the intervention, then it's even more powerful than these two, because it combines these two. Because one can think that even if two groups can be very similar, the fact that one group gets a treatment and that another group doesn't get a treatment will affect their respective behavior. Their comparability they can be, at the start, they can be very comparable groups, but then their characteristics may change because of things that are unrelated to the intervention. And then the ideal and the gold standard, quote unquote, of these techniques is these randomized control trials, where you artificially almost built, as they do in medicine. In fact, this was started in the 19th century in medicine. You give placebo and you give a vaccine to a treatment group, with them knowing, is to do exactly what was done in medicine, but in the social sciences. So let's do a little bit of an exercise. Okay, let's criticize a bit the identification assumption of every one of these. So the before and after methodology, what the identification assumption is that nothing else than the program happened to beneficiaries No, sorry, this is not before this. Yes, this is before and after. Is that the only thing before and after the identification assumption is that apart from the program and your intervention, nothing else changes during the time you're measuring the outcome. And that's very strong. By the way, before and after is probably 95% of statements that you hear. We've done this and poverty has declined. We've done that and learning has improved. Most statements, public statements about any intervention falls into before and after category. And it's probably the weakest identification assumption that you can find, because always ask yourself, what would, what happened during this time that could have affected the outcome? So that's a very good question. Whenever a new program is going to start, the best is to start measuring outcome before anything happens. We call this a baseline. But it's not always possible. Very often, a researcher is asked or is interested to know the impact of a program after it happened. And then it's very difficult because you need to find data before the program started. But it's possible. I'll show you real life examples where we have done this. Okay, let me go a little bit faster. I think you got the point about the identification assumption. I'll go through examples, and I'll share the presentation. Let me go to a real example of impact evaluation. And this I worked on in Morocco when I was based there. So that was an impact evaluation of a land titling program. So you often hear that it's good to give land titles to people or to farmers. And this because it will improve land tenure security and it will improve investment, etc. Why we decided at the time in Morocco to do an impact evaluation of that? Because intuitively, this is why I say a lot of decisions are based on intuition and beliefs. It seems like a good idea. Give titles to people, protects them. They can use it maybe to borrow. They can sell their land if they want. Giving titles seems the most obvious public intervention you can think of. The problem is that nothing is free. And we had estimated that property registration in Morocco at the time, 10 years ago, was close to $900 per plot, more expensive for bigger ones. So it's expensive to get titles. And often it's free. And in Morocco at the time, there was between 2.5 and 3 million unregistered properties. People have traditional titles, but registered in the cadastre, in the model system, there were between 2.5 and 3 million. So estimate the cost if you want. And by the way, the time it takes to register, we estimated that it would take a century, maybe 50 years to register everyone. And it would cost $3 billion. So the question of whether Morocco should invest $3 billion in registering all rural, I'm talking only rural properties in Morocco is a big question. It's really a big policy question. And okay, let me go a bit faster on the history. You don't need to know the research. So the questions that we asked ourselves, whether $3 billion should be invested on all the technology, etc., for decades to register everyone, is it important for investment? The belief that farmers who receive a title feel protected and they will invest more in their land is a nice belief. Is it true or not? On Morocco, we don't know. And the studies vary. The same thing, so, and we estimated the large-scale land titling would actually $2 billion in net present value. Is it worthwhile? Because maybe it's worthwhile to invest $2 billion if the investment in agriculture and the taxation of agriculture would pay for this $2 billion. So we had to do a cost-benefit analysis. Another question is, Should registration be free? Government could charge, but it's expensive. These are poor farmers, and it's not obvious to measure this because the assumption that secured property rights, that is titles, is key for investment, for their own effort, for productivity is an open question. But on the other hand, not all farmers invest. Not all farmers want to take risk. Not all farmers want to buy property. So we don't know whether, comparing, let me put it this way, comparing farmers who have titles with farmers who don't have titles is very biased, because the fact that the farmer has a title maybe is because the farmer wanted to invest and therefore needed titles. We're not sure whether it's investment decision that's driving a farmer to get a title or it's the other way around. That's the causality argument. So here's what we did. And this is ex post, meaning we didn't do a before and after. We just looked, we did a survey of farmers that's in pink, who have a title in Morocco in 2 regions. These are thousands of farmers, so very rigorous survey. And we compared different outcomes with farmers in the same districts who have no titles. That's the blue. And we normalized at 100. And we measured through questionnaires, etc. We measured a number of variables: community of investment, probability of investing, access to credit, use of inputs and fertilizer, productivity, output per hectare. Through this survey, by comparing those who have a title and those who don't have a title, we find huge difference. We find those who had titles invested much more. We find they 50% more chance of investing, more had access to credit, 50% more chance, more used fertilizer, and productivity was like 2.5 higher. What's wrong with that? Should we, based on this survey of those who have titles and those who don't have titles, just conclude and say, titling, look at the impact. These are huge impacts. Should we conclude that titling should be generalized in Morocco? Okay. Look. Okay, so let me. What's the identification assumption here? That's an impact evaluation, by the way. Yeah? What's the identification assumption behind this result? What am I assuming? If I tell you, look, those who have titles have 2.5 more cumulative investment than those who don't have titles, what am I assuming? They have both same situations. So these are farmers in the same area, same geographical area, same district. Same wealth. That's controlling, same wealth. That's a big assumption. So big identification assumption is that the reason, so there's characteristics, but these characteristics we can observe. So through regression analysis and econometrics, you can discount that. You can, in fact, I'm going to show that. You can discount, you can control plot size, you can control wealth, you can control family size, you can control geographical conditions, etc. But one thing you cannot control and you don't observe, which is a very strong and dubious identification assumption, is to say the reason these people have a title and these on blue don't have a title is unrelated to their productivity. It's luck or it's bad luck. And that's a very strong assumption. You're basically saying anybody who has a title is exactly the same as someone who doesn't have a title. And the reason these guys have a title has nothing to do with investment, with credit, with etc. While I could tell you, if you tell me this is your identification assumption, I could tell you, well, maybe the reason every one of these wanted a title or went and got a title was that they wanted to invest. It has nothing to do with their title. It's just that they wanted to invest. And because they wanted to invest, for whatever reason that we don't observe, maybe they're more entrepreneur, maybe they went and got a title. So the title has nothing to do with their incentive to invest. The incentive to invest came first, and then they said, I'm going to invest. I would like my land to be protected because I'm going to dig a well. So I'm going to get a title. It could be the other way around. It could be the other way around. So, but we don't know because we don't have a counterfactual. We don't observe the blue ones with a title, and we also observe the pink ones without a title. So this is what we did to solve this problem. So what we did is that we realized that in these two areas of Morocco, they were in the past, in the 80s, they did large programs of free property registration. And basically, the government had big maps. We saw these maps, in fact, and they drew limits, and they said, this whole surface, we're going to go and spend 1 year and give titles to everyone. And we exploited that. How did we exploit that? This is one of the areas. These are the lands, these are the plots. By the way, the plot size, it was about the same in this area. But it happened that in 1981, in this very area, the government said, those on this side, we're going to give them titles. Just because they couldn't do it everywhere, so they used administrative limits. Or, like for example, here there's a road. And they basically said, from this road all the way here, we're going to give titles. And these guys will give them later. Problem is that Morocco had a crisis and they didn't have enough funding. So these guys, they never came and gave them titles. We exploited that. How did we exploit that? So land 82, sorry. So here there was a large scale titling operation, and this one no titling operation. What we did is that we said the plots and the farmers that are the most that look the most the same are the ones who are close to the border. So basically, we surveyed and sampled the farmers a few kilometers on this side of the border, a few kilometers on that side of the border, and we said, these are really, when you look at it, and we had surveys of all of that, these are very similar areas. Same geology, same land, same crop, same everything. It's just that those on this side were unlucky. They were just on the wrong side of the road. And those on this side were more lucky. And therefore, our identification assumption is when this program started in 1982, these farmers were exactly the same as these farmers. And the reason why these have a title and these don't have a title, the only reason is that they were unlucky to be on the wrong side of the road. So it's almost a randomized trial. It's not controlled. It's not an experiment. It's a quasi-experiment. And we exploited that in two regions, Meknes and Sefrou. In Meknes, that's the result. On all the investment, credit, fertilizer, productivity, no difference between the two. These are the farmers with a title on the right side of the road. These are farmers without a title on the other side of the road. By the way, it's not black and white. In every field work, you know that. There's always special cases. We found farmers on the other side who paid for a title themselves. So there was a lot of econometrics behind it to correct all these things. But basically here, that's a much more credible identification assumption. The identification assumption here is not that as the first one, farmers who have a title are the same as farmers with no title. The identification assumption here is those who were on one side of the road and those who were on the other side of the road, over this 20-year period, they remain about the same. Nothing has changed for them. It is true for climate, which is important for agriculture. They got the same rain because they're in the same area. They have the same crops, same crop size, same family size. Their characteristics remain the same. So identification assumption seems okay. Yeah. So I just want to see, I'll compare. I just want to compare how much you can get things wrong when your identification assumption is weak and you do things the easy way. Just doing a survey would have gotten that result. Doing it rigorously gives us zero impact. This is why impact relations are important. So yes, it is not a perfect evaluation. It is not this impossible evaluation when you get the same farmer and observe him for 20 years with or without a title, because that's impossible. But every impact evaluation, no matter how rigorous it is, even randomized control trials, has an identification assumption that can be criticized. It's never perfect. Here, my assumption is that this farmer and this farmer have very similar characteristics and they haven't changed for 20 years. But it may not be true. Someone may tell you, oh, yes, but maybe because this farmer now he was surrounded by many people with titles who were investing, his behavior changed. Maybe this farmer became angry that he didn't get the title and he's seeing the others, so he moved out of his land, he quit agriculture. Who knows what can happen? There's many things we don't observe. So yes, even in this example, which looks really cool of comparability, my only point is that the identification assumption is stronger than the earlier, than that evaluation. It is stronger, no doubt. Is it perfect? No. That's something I'd like you also to go back with, is that every evaluation has an explicit or implicit identification assumption, and it's never perfect. It's an assumption. Then the debates on impact evaluations is usually about, is it strong or not, the identification assumption, and people fighting and saying, no, you can't assume that, etc. You had a question.
Suppose if the program started, intervention started in, let's say, 1980, if you look at data in 1985, if you look at back in 1990, 1995, and then 2000, so this graph would be very different. Is the behavior that has changed over the past 20 years that have resulted in the production or in the investment being similar on both sides of the line? So it's sort of an induced behavior.
So first of all, we could not measure through time. We only have 2 data points. We had data before the land titling, and we had data when we did the survey, 2015, I think. So no, we don't know what happened in Benin, and yes, maybe there was changed behavior. We are unable to say whether both of them, whether there was any induced change. No, there's many things we're not observing. The only thing we're saying is that these 2 groups are comparable, and if land titling had an impact, we would observe a difference here.
Export pattern, and they do the same to increase their productivity on the other side. Don't have them.
That's a very good point. Okay, that was your point. Okay, yes, very good, very good. So these kind, okay, what you're hearing this, naturally some here have seen these techniques before, but for the others, what these kind of debates are exactly the debates in academia. Whenever there's a paper on impact evaluation, what they're doing here, they are challenging the identification assumption. That's exactly what what I encourage you to do every time. Every time you read one, trying to find what's weak in the identification assumption. So what you're saying is that this farmer has been observing this one. So this one may have gotten a title, and because he got the title, it's my assumption, is very motivated to invest now. He invests, and then the person not far looks at that, looks at export, they're making money, and imitates and start doing the same, and therefore there's no difference. Because in this graph here, by the way, it doesn't mean nothing happened, because we normalize at 100. So it could be that both invested, and we have data on that. So what you're saying is that there's imitation, learning by observing the others, and it happens a lot in agriculture. Farmers observe each others. And what you're pointing to in impact evaluations is a situation where the treatment group has polluted, quote unquote, the control group. Treatment is influencing control. So yes, that could be a possibility. What we did to measure that, to counter this criticism of our identification assumption, is that we did the same analysis, restricting to farmers who are like 10 kilometers away from the border, with farmers that are 10 kilometers much further than the border. And we ignored those who were really close. So we're comparing people who are not observing each other. But you can still tell me, yes, but all of these are observing, and maybe there's learning by doing, and for 20 years it trickled. That's true. It is true. It is true. That's a valid criticism of our identification assumption, which makes it not perfect. So it's well taken.
Given information regarding weather forecasts and via WhatsApp message or a message, but then they would share this information with others as well.
Very true. Very true. Very true. So that is what could be happening. Everybody, the control group got polluted. I'm going about this pollution. I don't have a note. I need to find a better word than pollute. Spillover. Yes, spillover is
non-compliance is what we use in analysis. Is when
so I'll come back to this example in the second example. By the way, that was in one region. In the second region called Sefru, we found a big difference between the two. We found that those who had titles invested more than those not titles. So it was puzzling why in Mechanis there was no difference, and in Sefru there is, which is a little bit of and I'll tell you what's our hypothesis of why, but it's a little bit of a rebuttal of this criticism of imitation. Still, the impact was much lower than the initial method, the non-rigorous method. The rigorous method found a difference, but a much smaller difference. Now, in Sefru, our explanation of why titles in our hypothesis mattered and had impact, that's picture from Sefru. It's much more mountainous. There's a lot of water ponds like this. There's a lot of rocks. When you have rocks in agriculture, I'm not an agriculture specialist, but it takes a lot of investment to get rocks out of the soil. When you have water ponds like this in the mountain, you need to invest pumps, you need to invest in material to bring water down. While in the other region, it was rain-fed. Which means that in Sefru, investment is important. There's also fruit trees in Sefru. Fruit trees take 4, 5, 7 years to produce. Which means the hypothesis is that you need much more tenure security and property security in a context where you need to make big investments, like bringing kilometers of water, or invest in trees, or take rocks out. Maybe you need more security, and maybe this is why the land title brings you. It's security of your investment. While in Mechanis it was cereals, and cereals is relatively simple. You don't have much to do in rate-fed cereal. Let me go. Okay, let me conclude on this study. Why, without going into, actually, this is interesting. That's another finding which is interesting. Impact evaluations, I've been presenting them a bit like it's about things work or things don't work. Beyond that, the value of impact evaluation is that the amount of data you collect through this exercise makes you or the government learn a lot about what's actually going on. And for example, here, just by chance, because we included that in the questionnaire, we realized that conflicts between farmers, there's always sometimes border conflicts which comes, increased in the treatment group, meaning the titling operation led to a resurgence of conflicts between farmers, which is something you would expect the opposite. You would say when people have titles, things are very clear, very settled, there's less conflict. The problem is that when you start giving titles, then the tree that nobody cared about, which is in between my property and the next property, and we didn't really care who it was, when we're going to put it on paper, then that tree becomes important. And that anecdote that I just cited is reflected in the data. We found that treatment group had more border conflicts than control group, which was puzzling, and which also begs the question of carefully knowing the benefits of titling is important, because you don't want to create problems if and conflicts when the impact is not big enough. Yeah. Okay, I think you got the point. I'm not going to get you'll get the presentation. I'll ask Chad to share it with the whole so that you can see. Yes, that's one thing I should say. I presented things like those who had titles, who did not have titles, but the econometrics behind it is more complicated, because in reality, it's not perfect 100%, 0%. In treatment group, 84% got titles. But in control group, still about a third got titles at the same time, because they heard or because they needed to invest. So it's not just about comparing one about the other. There's econometric techniques to be able to really identify the conclusion of this study. That was important for the government, which asked for this study, is that number one, not everyone necessarily needs a registered title. Maybe in Sefru it was impactful, and in areas where you need a lot of investment, it's more needed. So if the government has a limited budget, the studies is not about to say by a perfect answer, do it or don't do it. It's about helping in prioritizing. So we told them, if you want to start a titling program, maybe start it in areas where there's a lot of investment for farmers to do to increase their productivity, as in Sefru, vis-a-vis cereals areas where the investment is very low. And that helps government make choices. So that's important. It's not about do it or don't do it, but it's more about nuancing the priorities based on where interventions are more impactful or not. Okay. Okay, I won't go into the details. Second example, also from my Morocco years, but that's even more relevant for Pakistan, is an evaluation of a conditional cash transfer program in education. This is Morocco, and its dropout rates. By sixth grade, there's about at the time in rural areas, these are rural districts, about 50% of girls would drop out of school. And it's very high for boys as well. So we targeted districts where dropouts of girls or children in general were very high. And when you talk to, we interviewed parents, teachers, as well as the government. The parents tell you poverty is an issue, meaning it's costly to send your children to school. There's worries about the walking distance to school. These are things we hear in Pakistan as well, including absence of separate lavatories for girls, especially in middle school. And then the third reason parents would tell you is teachers' absenteeism, quality of teaching, school infrastructure. Teachers would add to all these three reasons their own living conditions, saying it's very difficult for us. This is why we're absent all the time. Ministry tells should invest on everything, and the central ministry were even adding should be computers. So at the end, when you ask all stakeholders, basically it's an impossible decision for the government. It's like you need to solve everything. You need to have cash transfers to address poverty. You need to have safe transport. You need to invest in laboratories. You need to improve conditions of teachers. You need computers. It's not very useful as a list. And this is why we suggested to start a conditional cash transfer program that is randomized. And we recommended that it starts as a pilot, not as a national program, to see first if it works, if really giving cash to parents if they send their children to school improves things. But more interestingly, we asked a number of questions. We said, if we're going to do a pilot, let's work with the government to not just do what other countries like Mexico have done, but let's try to do things, to try different models and see what works best. So, for example, we said, should Morocco have a conditional cash transfer program or a non-conditional one? The difference is that in a conditional program, like Wasila Ta'lim, if a child is absent 2 days or 3 days, they don't get the cash. Okay? So you may think it's good because that's an incentive for the parents to send their children to school. On the other hand, one can think that it's very unfair because who gets absent from school very often? It's usually the poorest household because their children are more often sick, their children are more often far from school, or their parents need them more often at home to work on the field. So penalizing through a conditional cash transfer program households, children who don't go to school more often there's a trade-off. It can be seen as very unfair to the poorest households. On the other hand, there's an incentive effect that's interesting to incentivize parents to send them. But it's a big question, and at the time, that was in 2007 or 2010, nobody had asked this question. Unconditional cash transfer program were very popular around the world, so everybody did the same thing. Everybody did conditional CCTs, as we call them. We said, let's try to do an unconditional one and see the difference. And then the other question is, should the money go to the father or the mother? Most programs give money to the mothers. But in Morocco, there was a big question. Number one, not all mothers had the ideas. They didn't have the equivalent of Najy and CNICs. So it was a big problem to get, and very expensive to get all mothers to get ideas. And these programs usually give to mothers. So we stepped back and we said, does it make a difference to give to the mother versus the father? In the literature, we don't really know. There's also some who say, yes, even the programs that give to the mother, the father asks her for the money right after, so it doesn't really make a difference. So we wanted to understand that. Okay, so let me not go into. So here are the questions we wanted to answer. Should Morocco do an unconditional program or a conditional cash transfer? Basically, what we did is that we selected areas and villages and schools in the poorest districts of Morocco, and we randomly selected some of them to receive a non-conditional cash transfer program, one of them, and 3 of them to receive a cash transfer, and a conditional cash transfer. So another design question that we asked and that we try to answer, and sorry, I go a little bit in details, but it's to give you a sense that these impact evaluations are not just academic exercises to show that something works or doesn't. You can use them to help a government or a program design the best way of doing things. And one big question that was unanswered in the literature is, okay, if you have a CCT, you need to measure the condition, like the condition in education is 3 days of absence a month, and you lose the transfer. How do you measure these 3 days? These are remote schools in rural areas. So one is to count on the teachers, okay? Just the presence sheets. We tested that. One group were basically relying the presence of for measuring the presence based on teachers' sheets. But that's not obvious because teachers live in villages, live in a context. You know, maybe they feel for the family or the children, and they're going to cheat. So we're like, okay, let's see if that happens. And we can understand why they cheat. I mean, sometimes for good reasons, to protect poor children or poor families. Could be for bad reasons, friends, etc. And so we wanted to see whether there's benefits for, if you believe CCTs are important to have the right information. You don't want unfairness either. Second was to have the ministry send inspectors randomly to check presence, so that we verify what the teachers are feeling. And third thing we tried was digital prints. Every child would go into class and put their fingers so that and you can use that. That's the perfect method, perfect data, and because you have perfect information. As I said, we had one group that's unconditional and 3 that's conditional, and we also tried to see whether among the issues whether providing some infrastructure in the schools was more important than cash transfers. So the supply side issue. So we provided laboratories, heaters in some schools, but not in others. And then we wanted to know whether it's better to give to the mother or to the father. So that's a lot of questions. That's one impact evaluation where we embedded all these questions by creating different groups and testing all of these. And in the end, we had a huge impact evaluation. We had 120 targeted districts, or not districts, schools, catchment areas. In the first group, that was the control group, basically there was no cash transfer. But even the first group, 120 schools, half of them received infrastructure investment, water and sanitation and heaters, the others not. Just to measure just comparing these two groups is an impact relation. It's seeing whether infrastructure, heaters, and water and sanitation improves outcome. And then we had an unconditional control group. Then we had a group where monitoring, gonna need to accelerate because I have a 4 p.m. meeting. We have a group where we have monitoring by teachers, another one teachers and inspectors, and a third and a fourth one, and the fifth one digital. So in total, we had 120 schools as control group and 360 schools as treatment group with all these treatments. So this is probably the most complicated impact evaluation I've seen, and that's the. Okay, so a few, and I'll tell you the results in a few minutes. But a few things to keep in mind. I forgot the term you proposed. Spillovers. So we needed to make sure that treatment and control schools were not too close, because then parents would hear about it. We needed to do even more than that. When we send students like you to do, or maybe undergraduate students, not graduates like you, to do the surveys, we had a problem because when we trained the students on all the surveys, you imagine how much data was collected for this exercise. We had to do separate training for the students or the firm survey that would survey the treatment group, then the control groups in two different. We didn't want them to know, because in treatment groups, that's a big concrete problem. You know, when you do survey, I don't know if any of you have done surveys in the field. It's very complicated. You need to convince a family to sit with you. Sometimes they don't want to answer. What we were fearing, and we saw that during a pilot, is that the enumerators who would do the survey, they would tell, oh, there's a program from the government that's coming. Do answer the question because it will help the program come. Just that could bias the result And because the behavior inside the controlled villages would have changed if they knew there was a program maybe coming later. Because of course, Morocco wanted to do a national program. And these controlled group schools were not banned forever, obviously. It was to give them the program later. So we had to do the trainings in separate places. You know, it's this kind of attention you need to invest in to get an unbiased sample. We didn't want to have, I was at the World Bank, but we didn't want a World Bank project or donor funded. We wanted it to be pure government, because there can be a bias when a program is done by a foreign agency, an NGO or a donor. It can be, everything can be perfect. So when you evaluate it, its external validity, as we call it, meaning being able to extrapolate and see and say when the program will become national, you can extrapolate these results. You need to make an assumption that when it will be expanded, the capacity, the quality of the program will be the same. And a pilot done by an international NGO can be all nice and perfect. It doesn't tell you what will happen when it will be expanded at scale in the country. So here on purpose, we said to the ministry, you know, get some budget, do it alone. Don't get too sophisticated, because then you will know the reality of the implementation when it will be at scale. So the results, this is where you learn. You know, the most sophisticated group where you put your finger on presence didn't work. Disaster. Why you think this group did not work? Not stolen, no. What do you do with this at home? I mean, you can sell it, but no, it worked. It was on. No, because we registered all the children on day one. Exactly. So that was the problem. It worked perfectly well. Huh? I saw myself, the children, they were very happy and exciting. First day of school, they put their finger and there was a voice that would tell them, welcome, marhaban to school, etc. What happened is that this machine was so perfect that when you got the data through Excel sheet, not only you observed absence and presence of children, but some days there was nothing. What does it mean when there was nothing? No teacher, the teacher. So the teacher started breaking the machines, take the battery out. So most machines, after 4 months, were out of function, and the teachers didn't bother putting. Basically, these machines were measuring teachers' presence, and teachers, they don't like to be measured. So that group didn't work. We had to abandon that group. That's we sometimes, governments or donors, we always think about perfect interventions. It was a reality check of not understanding the incentives of teachers in particular. Huge impact on attendance. So it worked. Cash transfers worked. Absenteeism was down, brought out was down, and the impact was much bigger for girls. That's the most interesting finding, is that the conditional group, the CCT, had the same positive results, but the same result as unconditional. That was a big surprise. Unconditional was basically, if you register your child at the start of the year, then throughout the year you get the transfer, whether the child comes or not. Same impact, which means, this in Morocco context, it was not the incentive, it was a poverty issue. It was people said, okay, if we're starting to get, the government is giving us cash transfers to send to school, school is valuable. And this cash is important for us. So that was interesting, because unconditional is much cheaper. There's not these controls, no verification. It's more fair, because even children from very poor families, if they get sick 1 week, family still gets the transfer. So that was a big finding. Since then, that was in 2010, the paper is available. Since then, there's been a number of comparison impactuations in other developing countries, which have confirmed this result, that unconditional can work as much, can work the same as conditional. Giving transfer to mothers worked slightly better. It was not a big impact, a little bit on attendance, a little bit. The sad impact is that there was no impact on learning. As many of you said, to improve learning, you need teacher to improve, you need books. So having kids in school was good, but their test scores did not improve, which meant there's other things to do, obviously. And all the treatment groups that we tested had about the same impact. And that's it, and I'm done. And I'll share the presentation because all the papers or the references I covered are here. So let me end here because I have a meeting in 5 minutes, but I'm happy to take any additional question before. In case of
renewables energy source in Pakistan, what should I do? Like, what would be the dimensions you suggest to do this?
So what would be what's the intervention you want to measure?
Like in adding new capacity in terms of just renewable energy.
At the national level?
Yes.
In a village or?
Just in case of Islamabad.
Islamabad.
Yeah.
What do you want to know?
Impact of solarization.
First, impact on what?
Solarization impact, like impact evaluation of solarization, how it contribute to. I know that installed capacity is increased, but some other impact it created.
So the
Maybe
first step,
that
the first step is to choose the outcome that you increase capacity is almost an input, in that logical framework. Maybe not in output, it's still an output. It's an output. Why do we want increased capacity? We want people to have more reliable electricity, lower bills. So you need to define what's the ultimate outcome you want to measure. That's the first thing I would do. And then the second thing, you want to find a methodology, a counterfactual, an identification assumption to define the technique you want to use to be able to answer your impact question in a rigorous manner.
Or, what other ways can we find that something else that will have an impact on learning?
So that would be a whole different impact relation. We know that cash transfers and bringing children to school is not enough. Then what works is a new impact relation. You have to say, okay, maybe it's about textbooks, maybe it's about the quality of teaching of the teachers.
But that something cannot be measured with the survey that we conducted.
No, we did not measure. We actually measured presence of teachers and how many minutes during the course they're actually teaching versus asking children to work by themselves and sitting. We measured that, and the intervention had no impact on that. But we did measure that. Last question.
Looking at like projects or public expenditures, what if there's a project, there's an intervention, but there are unintended results that we get later down the years, let's say 8 or 10 years down the year, but it's not exactly the outcome that we are looking for.
That's a very good question. So so you can, there's different outcomes you could see unexpectedly, but the important point you're making is that we did this impact evaluation, and actually I'm actually reviewing a paper on that. It's been now 15 years or 12 years, is how long you're going to follow an impact evaluation, because some things like schooling have long-term impacts.
Exactly.
But you cannot always keep following control and treatment group for a long time. So for example, in Morocco, based on these strong results, now this program is called Taysir. Taysir is a national program. They expanded it nationally. And when they expand nationally, you lose your control group. There's no more control group. So it's very difficult for an impact evaluation to measure over the long term outcomes, and it's rare and it's very difficult. They're trying to do it for Taysir, but there's no more control group, because the control group received Taysir maybe 3-4 years after the start. Thank you so very much, everyone.